Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a part two of this little draft series we're going to be doing here. Today, we're going to be, or not today, but just a few hours after the first video, we're going to be taking a look at rounds 24 to um, rounds probably about 22. We're probably going to go 24 to 22. That sounds about good. So, we'll kick things off with 24. And the absolute worst pick here by far was cornerback Jarren Williams by MILF. This is an absolute bust. He ended up doing absolutely nothing this season. I don't think he scored a single point. I don't even know if he was on a roster this season, but yeah, that's an absolute bust for MILF. I don't even think he was on a roster, like I said. At the number 11 spot, you have Karen taking Greg Dulcich. Now, this is a surprising one. Whenever I was making this list, I thought Greg Dulcich was going to be a little bit better. You can see he was owned by 7% of the league pretty much, but he got cut by Denver like immediately into the season and then came back for one game and just got cut again. So Greg Dulcich scored 5 points and that was it. This was a horrible pick. It wasn't really fully Karen's husband's fault because I believe he was actually supposed to play at the early part in the season, but he ended up not doing it and he ended up being a complete bust. At the number 10 spot, you had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking former Chicago Bear Travis Gibson, who had 14.5 net points on the season. He started the season out being a Bear before being traded to Tennessee, but he really didn't do much for either of them, to be honest. I think he had a sack against Atlanta, but that's about all he did this season. And overall, that's an absolute bust. At the number 9 spot, you had Toxic taking Mecole Hardman. This is yet another bust. At least he had 30 points, though, scattered across a few games, so at least he was playing, which I can't really say for the other guys. And even then, he wasn't playing for quite a lot of the games. Mecole Hardman, as wide receiver, was definitely a bust for Toxic Zenpai. At the number 8 spot, we had Donovan Peoples-Jones. This is yet another bust. This whole fucking round is looking like a bust. But Donovan Peoples-Jones by Big Yawners is going to be a bust. Yet another receiver taken in this round, only 4 points more than Mecole Hardman. And his points were just a little bit more scattered out, so at least if you played him, you'd get something, which is more than I can say for Mecole Hardman, which slightly edges him over Mecole Hardman, but that's about all I can put him, though. At the number 7 spot, fucking Kadarius Toney made it all the way to number 7, but here he is. He was still a bust, don't get me wrong, but he was considerably better than both Donovan Peoples-Jones and of Mecole Hardman, Foxy Zenpai, and Big Yawners. But Rotatorship at this spot took Kadarius Toney, who had a couple okay games, but it's still an absolute bust. But at least he had a couple okay games that made it to where he stood out significantly compared to the other two receivers I just mentioned. At the number 6 spot, I had myself taking Shaquille Leonard at the linebacker position. Absolute bust yet again. With Shaquille Leonard, he started the season playing for the Colts and ended up going to the Eagles afterwards. He had a good start week 1. He was looking pretty good, and he just kind of fell off since then. He had a couple okay games for the Eagles later on in the season, but it really wasn't that great, though. And overall, it's definitely a bust. Could have been a lot better. A lot of better linebackers were taken after this guy. But overall, still a bust. At least he played, though. At the number 5 spot, we had Pussy taking Rondale Moore. This is yet another bust at the wide receiver position, only scoring 105 net fantasy points on the season. I put him over Shaquille Leonard because he had 2 games where at least he was a good starter. And then after that, he was okay in a couple games, but for the most part, he was bad, and overall, he's just the definition of a bust. The other guys below him have just been ridiculously horrible. At the number 4 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Bryce Young. Bryce Young was not a good fantasy option this season at all. I pretty much just had him higher than the other guys, like, say, Rondale Moore, for example, just because of the fact that at least he was a quarterback that could score points. Not every game was he good. Like, most games were horrible, but at least he had a couple games where he could put up quarterback numbers. So I put him just slightly higher than Rondale Moore. Overall, neither of them were good. Both are busts for Mr. Steeler Girl and Pussy. At the number 3, we're going to skip the Mez and go straight to a hit. We have Booty Basher taking Romeo Doubs, the wide receiver from Green Bay. Overall, jumping from 100 points to 176 points is fantastic, especially during the games where Christian Watson was out. Romeo Doubs went out there and did really, really very good. He did 18 to 20 points for most of the weeks throughout the first 4 weeks. He had quite a few weeks with 11 to 15 points. Don't get me wrong, he had a bad late stretch of the season, but for the most part, especially for this late in the draft, Romeo Doubs is just about as good as you could ever ask for. That was a definite hit right there for Booty Basher. At the number 2 spot, we had PMC Wagner taking Jawan Bentley, linebacker for the Patriots. This is going to be a hit. He overall started the season very, very, very roughly. Well, not very, very, very roughly, but he kind of went all over the place, is what I mean. He's still a hit, but he was so inconsistent, I couldn't put him any higher here. This is the number 2 spot, keep in mind. He had some really good weeks that carried him, but he had a couple weeks where he just got like 5 points, 7 points, 8 points, stuff that is very disappointing for a linebacker to say the least. But he also had his good weeks as well with 38, 23, 15. He proved to be a startable linebacker to say the least. I'd say he was pretty weak compared to a lot of other linebackers that are going to be seen as hits on this list. But for where he was here, I'd say this is overall a hit. He went out there and did his job throughout the season. So I'd say that's for how shitty this round is for picks, I'd say he's the number 2 spot. Number 1 is actually J-Bay taking Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson went out there, and I believe he was the 8th highest scoring tight end in all of fantasy, which still isn't elite or anything. But for 177 points for what you're getting here in your tight end, you're getting a starting tight end that's going out there and more weeks than not is getting 10 points plus. Overall, this is as good as you can ask for from a tight end that's not Travis Kelce, George Kittle, or one of the other guys. Very consistent. He went out there and held his own. This guy's not the reason you're losing games. He's actually going out there and helping you win. Overall, this is a very good pick for J-Bay and an absolute hit and the best pick for round 24. Moving right on to round 23, we are going to take a look at the number 12 spot for round 23, and the number 12 spot for 23 I had was Trayvon Campbell, the cornerback for MILF. That was an absolute bust. I don't believe he actually played a single snap this season. If he did play a snap, that is. But no, he didn't score a single fantasy point. He apparently scored -4 fantasy points against the Saints, but that didn't even count against him. Overall, horrible pick for MILF. Did not help at all, and that dude was an absolute bust. The number 11 spot, you had Toxic Zenpai going wide receiver, Michael Gallup. That was an absolute bust. Yet again, 91 points on the season. If your receiver is getting under 100 points, I don't care if you took him in round 27, it's going to be a bust. He had a few games of upside, sure, but that's only about 4 of his games out of the season where he actually did okay. Definitely a bust nonetheless. Better than some of the receivers we saw in that last round, but this round, he's definitely not good, and he's going to take the number 11 spot. At the number 10 spot, we had J-Bay taking Marvin Mims, who just scored about 20 more points than Michael Gallup. And he was horrible throughout the late stretch of the season, especially the middle stretch of the season. But those early games, he showed a lot of upside. Had a few games where he scored about 7 to 10 points, a 13-point game against New England. And I thought, even though this is still a bust, this is still a little bit better than Michael Gallup and your other receivers from the last round. And speaking of receivers, at the number 9 spot, we've got Tyler Boyd, who I'm going to bump up to the meh category. He had 147 points, had close to 150. He's very close between the meh and the bust category. I love Tyler Boyd, and I hate to say it, but he had games where he showed upside, were 10 to 16 points, sometimes 20. But a lot of those games were games where it was relied on for other receivers like T. Higgins or Jamar Chase to be out. And unfortunately for Tyler Boyd, he never really got the same volume as them. But he went out there and actually put up numbers at least. So I'd say he's at least meh. But I can't say he's a good pick, though, overall for this point in the draft. At the number 8 spot, we have Pussy taking defensive tackle Jonathan Allen. This is another meh. He definitely didn't go out there and do as good as he normally does. He was super inconsistent this season. Had a few good games, but until the later stretch of the season, he was extremely inconsistent. Was all over the place with his points. And if your guy is going to go from putting up 10 points to 2 points to 20 points, I'm just not a fan of it. Had 138.75 points net on the season. Definitely a lot of better defensive linemen ended up getting taken later on in the season. And overall, Jonathan Allen was just kind of meh. At least he had the upside to keep him in meh, or else he would have been a bust. At the number 7 spot, we had Karen's husband taking Cole Kmet, the Chicago Bears tight end. This is going to be a hit. This is a very borderline hit compared to some of the other ones, but he was basically right up there with Jake Ferguson of J-Bay from the last round, where he went out there, did very consistent throughout most of the games this season. He had 3 really bad games holding him back with the 2.9 and the 0 points respectively, but overall, for the most part this season, he was actually a surprisingly scoring tight end, going out there and putting up Travis Kelce numbers in a couple games. But overall, that's definitely a hit. And if it was in another round, I could see him actually being the number 1 spot. But this specific round was loaded with talent, though. At the number 6 spot, we had Booty taking Jaylen Warren, running back for Pittsburgh. This was an absolute hit. Another running back that goes out there and puts up almost 200 points, just like Karen's husband, Chuba Hubbard, from the later rounds. And especially that third quarter of the season, I guess you can call it, to the end of the season, he did fantastic, putting up almost 10 points every single game with those games of 19 to 30 point upside. This was an absolute hit. Getting a starting running back this late in the draft, absolutely what you want to go for. Definite hit right there. Again, all these guys that I'm about to mention, I could see being number 1s on other rounds, but this was just a stacked round to say the least. At the number 4 spot, or not number 4 spot, number 5 spot, we had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Baker Mayfield at quarterback position. Like I said, this is another hit. He went out there and for the most part this season did super, super consistent. For the most part, he had a couple games where he scored under 15 points, which definitely held him back. And he struggled to score over 20 quite a few times. But overall, scoring over 320 points for your quarterback this late in the draft, that's definitely a hit. I can't deny it. But overall, I don't think he was as good as some of these other guys that are about to be mentioned. At the number 4 spot, we had PMC Wagner taking Miami's team defense. Miami's team defense in a similar situation to the Chargers, but this time actually being a lot better and a lot more consistent. We're able to go out there and finish the number 7 team in all of fantasy, or number 7 scorer in all of fantasy, having amazing games against the Patriots, the Giants, the Jets, the Commanders, the Jets again. This is a defense where you could kind of predict when they were going to have their really, really good games and when they're going to have their bad games. And if you can predict that, they can be very, very useful for you. Remember, when it comes to team defenses in fantasy, it's just as much about the matchup as it is about the defense. And the Dolphins were a team that were known for causing turnovers and getting points when it came to fantasy. This is a great hit for PMC Wagner. At the number 3 spot, I had Rick Tatership here taking Raheem Mostert at the running back position. Now, 262 points at the running back position all the way in round 23. You're like, how the fuck is that not the best pick in the round? Well, you'll see in a second here, but Raheem Mostert, fantastic, fantastic pick. He did fantastic throughout the course of the season. Unfortunately, he had 3 games that really held him back where he just really struggled to even get points. And he did have ridiculous upside early on in the season, but you didn't see as much of that later on. But overall, he was a fantastic, fantastic pick that would easily make number 1. Hell, he would have been seen as a hit if he was taken in the first round. But overall, not as much as some of these other guys, I would say. At the number 2 spot here, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking DeForest Buckner. Taking DeForest Buckner here, fantastic pick, 218 points himself. At the defensive line position, if you can get a defensive lineman that's this consistent for the most part outside of weeks 3 and 4, where he's getting 15 points per week, you can see from week, let's say 5 on, this is part of the reason why Mr. Steeler Girl made that huge running stretch and started winning a lot of games and made a Final Four push. DeForest Buckner was one of those players that stepped the fuck up later in the season and did fantastic. One of the best defensive linemen in all of fantasy football this season. In Raheem Mostert, DeForest Buckner, and this guy in the number 1 spot could all be interchanged. All of them could be argued. These were fantastic, fantastic picks from this round. But we'll look at my number 1, which was Cleveland's defense, who by far, compared to the number 1 and number 2, I think it was by at least 30 to 40 points, scored the number 1 points in all of fantasy, whether it's quarterbacks, team defenses, you name it. The Browns defense was the best pick in fantasy when it comes to a points perspective. And with just how sheerly good they did this season, with the exception of a couple games like against the Rams, for example, they'd score at least 30 points every game. Sometimes they'd score fucking 83. Sometimes they'd score 52. Sometimes they'd score in the 50s. They were fantastic. This team if you had access to this Cleveland Browns defense this season, you probably found a lot of success, even if the rest of your team was struggling. And overall, the Browns defense was an absolute banger of a hit. Like I said, any of the top three could easily be seen. Actually, any of the hits in this round could have been seen as a number one spot in other rounds. And oh boy, this makes me sad. We go from going through all that beauty of picks to shit. Um, anyway, we'll kick things off at number 12 with Karen's husband taking Damian Harris. Damian Harris finished the season with a net 21 points. After week 4, he was done. Had one good game. This is an absolute bust, to say the least. Number 11, PMC Wagner taking Tank Bigsby. He slightly outscored Damian Harris with his points throughout the season, but he had multiple games where he actually scored negative fantasy points to under a point. Horrible pick overall, nonetheless. At least he played, though, and at least somewhat outscored Damian Harris. That's about as good as I can give him. At the number 10 spot, you had Dictatorship taking Treylon Burks from Tennessee, scoring almost 40 points. His main issue is injuries. He just can't stay healthy, causing him to play a limited snap amount in pretty much every game he plays. In this season was no exception. 12 points in week 2 was good, I guess. He had 10 points almost in week 15, but overall he was just kind of horrible this season, to say the least. But he still outperformed the other two guys, though. At the number 9 spot, you had J-Bay taking Jeff Wilson for the Dolphins, the worst running back in the Dolphins running back room this season, who really didn't do too much. He dealt with quite a few stupid injuries and stuff like that early on in the season. But even with that being said, he still outscored the other three guys we mentioned. This is still going to be a bust, don't get me wrong. But he had a couple games where he scored 6 to 10 points, which at least makes him somewhat salvageable compared to the other three busts. But this was a horrible pick, though. At the number 8 spot, you had Big Yawners taking Allen Lazard at wide receiver. Yet another bust. It's kind of crazy how these rounds went. This entire round was just filled with fucking busts, but the next round was just filled with gold. But with only 62 points, Allen Lazard at least was a player. I can say that, I guess. This is still a bust. He went out there and at least scored fantasy points in the majority of his games. Sometimes I couldn't even say he did that. But nonetheless, Allen Lazard is still a bust. At least he scored points, though. At the number 7 spot, we had Toxic Zenpai taking Riley Patterson. This is going to be yet another bust. With Riley Patterson, he only scored 100 fantasy points on the season, going on a 3-week stretch of scoring -1 fantasy point, scored -2 against Houston, 6 points against Carolina. Horrible end of the season. He had a couple good games this season and showed off some consistency at the start, but it fell off quickly after the halfway point in the season, and this is just overall a bust with only 100 points. At the number 6 spot, we had Scrambled and Wiggle Waggle taking Darnell Mooney. As a Bears fan, I hate to say it, but he was a bust. Only 83 points on the season. Showed a good week 1. Didn't score any fucking points throughout 3 of the next 4 weeks, but he did have quite a few weeks where he scored around 9 to 10 points, so I guess I'll give him that, which is what's holding him above everybody else. At least he scored 83 points this season, but overall it's definitely a bust. At the number 5 spot, we had MILF taking Darrell Taylor, the defensive end. This is another bust. Darrell Taylor for Seattle, of course. If this will load, had 94 points, just a little bit more than Darnell Mooney. He had a few weeks where he actually showed some upside, getting 10 to 17 points. A couple weeks, that is. And overall, at least he was playing. But overall, both him and Darnell Mooney are shit. I pretty much had him hired just because he's at a more useful or valuable position, and at least had a few games where he was actually seen as good. At the number 4 spot, I had myself taking Quentin Johnston, the rookie receiver for the Chargers, with 96 points, who had a horrible start to the season, all the way up to week 7. But then things started picking up for him later on in the season, just a little bit, where he was scoring 10, 13, 10, 14, 10. He had quite a few games that he could actually say were good, and a couple games where at least he scored around 5 points. So even though this is still an absolute bust, I would say it's definitely better than the other guys we mentioned. At the number 3 spot, we had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Harrison Smith. With Harrison Smith, I'm going to go ahead and call him a meh. Don't get me wrong, he scored more points than some safeties I've called a hit, or I've called a hit so far. But you look at his points distribution. He had games where he had 44 points, which was fantastic. But other than those 44 point games, he also had a few games where he had 3 points, quite a few times overall. He had games where he had only 7 points. He was kind of all over the place, and there were just better options throughout almost all of the weeks. You just had that one really high score that really inflated his numbers. Outside of that, though, Harrison Smith was just kind of meh as an overall player, especially since we're higher in the draft. I'm going to be a little bit more harsh on these rankings. At the number 2 spot, I had Pussy taking Devon Achane being an absolute hit. If he could stay healthy, this would have been the best pick here, without a doubt in my mind. Um, with that being said, he kept getting hurt later on in this, or early on in the season to the middle point in the season. But when he played, did fantastic. 62, 29, 27, 25, 12, 25. Fantastic player. Even with him being out for so many games, I'm still willing to call this a hit just for how ridiculously good he was, especially later in the season, or not later in the season, but especially when he was healthy. Um, at the number 1 spot, I had Booty taking Richie Grant, the safety for the Falcons, though. And like I said, if it weren't for Devon Achane's injuries, he would have definitely been number 1. But Richie Grant basically did everything that Harrison Smith struggled to do, and that's getting 10 points in almost every game. Sure, he had a couple of those games where he had 7 points. He had the one game with 1 point. But overall, you can see the level of consistency spread out a lot more. And he scored about 30 more points, which is what considerably bumped him up higher compared to Harrison Smith, at least for me. In Devon Achane, I figured was just a good in-between with Pussy, for example. That's why I'm putting Richie Grant higher, because Devon Achane just couldn't stay healthy, to say the least. But both are definitely hits. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. We're moving through this pretty quickly. We already got 6 rounds done. I hope you guys are enjoying it. Have a good one.